So thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation in Zimbabwe. As I was saying, it's my first visit here, so it's really a pleasure of being visiting you and spending this afternoon together. So today we will focus a little bit on the management and nutrition part regarding sow and piglet to improve prolificity and productivity on farm. We've seen this morning a lot of nice information coming from the presentation of our colleague from Topics. So it's good that we will have a lot of areas of synergies to cover through my presentation as well. So in particular, I will focus on this presentation on the period that we consider one of the most critical for pig production, which is the period that goes from the end of gestations to the beginning of the weaning of the piglets. So we will focus our target presentations on what is happening in this period. As you can see from the slide, you can consider that is part of my introduction. Those are all the critical moments and aspects that are involved and impacting our sow herd production that we have to somehow address in order to increase the productivity of our farm. Excuse my voice, but I think I've lost my voice over the past 20 minutes, so I hope it will come back. So everything that goes from day 110 of gestation, including transitions, farrowing, and weaning, is impacting dramatically the productivity of our farm. So we decided to focus our attentions on what is happening in that small period of time, but it's super critical for us to take it into control. So everything that goes from the proper management of the transfer of the sows from the gestation room to the farrowing room, managing a transition diet, taking care of the feeding schedule, a proper early lactation start, what to do, what not to do, some tips that will involve some practical aspect from both management and nutrition. So at the beginning, we will focus a little bit more on sow factors. So what are the areas we want to take into consideration in gestation, on transition, as I said? What are the key kinetics that are happening around farrowing? What we can do, what we should not do, what are the areas we should understand better? Where should we listen more to our animals, especially in that specific critical period? Colostrum, right? And colostrum management and proper management of milk production, and when to recognize if our sows is under stress. We have seen this morning there are a lot of climate changes happening. Our housing is not necessarily adapted to fast respond to what are the climate changes, and how do we want to recognize and make sure that our sows is in a much better conditions, because a stressed sow, a non-comfortable sow, is a sow that will not be up to meet the genetic potential that we have seen this morning. And of course, we have seen a little bit on the presentation of this morning how critical it is to manage a proper flushing diet to maximize the ovulation and the piglet that we get out of the next gestation. So first of all, gilt and sow condition in pregnancy, super critical, especially on the gilt side. That's where we put the money of our farm, especially on the new gilt that comes in. Remember the questions regarding natural inseminations. If I get to the point of getting not the right boar on that gilt, since the early beginning, I may even compromise the locomotory tract robustness of that animal. So that's super critical. We allow the gilt to mature enough before we breed, that we monitor the body weight conditions and the back fat measurement in the proper way during the entire evolution of this gilt. Also because everything that is happening in a very short period of time will have an impact on the animals. And if we get cold the sow before for parity, that's a tremendous loss of the animal. So here you can see some of the aspects that are critical for us to take into consideration when we are managing properly our sow herd. We don't want neither a too thin gilt, but neither a too fat gilt. So that's why in certain cases it's better to lose a heat, allow me to say that, than to push the animal if it's too thin, because that performance will be compromised in the future. And management properly of the feeding program of the gilt, which is not the same as a second, third, fourth parity sows, even from a feeding schedule perspective. So we have usually in Europe 2 different feeding schedules if you have gilts or multiparous sows, because what that animal need to do is a little bit different. Gilt is not coming from a negative energy balance from a previous farrowing, so you don't need, for example, to work on step feeding like you do it for high-low, high diet for a 2-second 3 parity. But on the gilt, for example, we work on a step feeding. What to do, for example, on the farm when we form the groups? We tend in Europe to work with group housing, and every country does a little bit different things, because you have countries that, for example, form the groups right after insemination. Certain countries form the groups 28 days after insemination. No matter which is your strategy, what is important is that as much as possible, you form homogeneous groups. If you can manage groups that have same age of parity, or groups that have same age of expected farrowing, that's also a good aspect to take into considerations. And important to monitor the sows, both if you use automatic feeding stations or direct manual feeding. Is important to see how the animals are performing. One of the most important aspects to take into consideration is if I have a very stressed herd, that stressed herd will perform much worse over the entire production. So for us, the concept of welfare and well-being is not necessarily correlated only to public opinion, but if we have an animal that is in a much more welfare situation, will be an animal that will perform much better and will be able to empower herself to meet the expectations of the potential that the genetic can allow. So for example, some practical aspect is, if we have an automatic feeding station, we need to allow the gilt to have enough time to get trained to the automatic feeding stations, and extra care on when we mix the groups. So one of the challenges we have today in Europe is that in certain countries, 3rd day after insemination, you move the sows already into a group. You can do it, but you need to be super careful. In a lot of countries in the southern part of Europe, we tend to wait 28 days before we move them, because we know we have missed the critical moment of implantation of embryos that we will see later. And as well, important to check which is the feed level. We were discussing this morning about conditions of the sow and proper nutrient management of the sow. If you consider how your body condition looks like of the animal, what is important is to adjust your feeding characteristics and your feeding amount you feed to the sow according to the body condition score you have there, which is not always helpful to do it visually. So that's why we use tools, we use fatometer or ultrasound to check and have a clear understanding on how much is the back fat of the sow. Because more and more we have lean genetics, so not necessarily your sow, if it's bigger, necessarily is fat. Sometimes it's super lean and does not have enough fat to empower a good milk production or a super good milk quality. So those are things we take into consideration. We focus from the transition moment, so from 110 days of gestation, because also in gestation we would need a lot of time to talk about it, because there are a lot of nutritional and management tips that we would need to put in place. But from transition is a very short period of time, because from 110 to 115, 16, 17 days, when your piglets are born, it's a super critical moment of the life of the sows, where also the nutritional requirements are changing, because the diet you feed to the animal in that moment is a combination between the lactation and the gestation need, because you need to have the animal quiet, so the amount of fiber and fermentable fiber you feed to the animal still is very relevant, because it will have an impact on reducing the risk of constipation. So if you have less constipation, farrowing process will happen much more smoother. You have the need of less minute between the born of one piglet to the other, will reduce the amount of stillborn. And at the same time, there are certain nutrients, certain technologies that can empower the animal to start a much better milk production, something that is not covered during the gestation feed. Still too much across the different countries. I see that gestation feed still is seen as a cheap feed that need to be allowing a saving on the farm because the sow is not producing in that moment, which is super far from reality. Your sow is like the money you put in a bank. You always want the money to be as much fruitable, as much profitable as possible. What is coming out of the sow is the money that you will get after when you will slaughter the pigs. So if you don't treat the sow properly during the gestation, and especially as well during the transition, you will have less impact at the end of the day as a ROI at the end of your production. So this is super critical that we take it into consideration also because a proper transition feeding schedule will also prevent you to have problems like MMA, mastitis metritis agalactia. So that will empower also the piglet to have more milk available and will make the life of those piglets much easier once they will be weaned. So what can we do? So, okay, before farrowing, we know that the sows reduce her activities and her interest on feed because she is in a very particular moment. The sow is, we talked this morning about Ferrari. I like to do the comparison between the sow and a super high performing athlete. If an athlete is not physically at his best or at her best, will not give you the performance you expect. So if Bolt would have not been in super good shape, would have not broke so many records on racing. The sow is the same. In every specific physiological stage, she's performing like a race. And especially around farrowing, with the new genetic, we have up to 20 piglets born alive in certain areas in the Northern European hemisphere. You need to make sure the well-being of the sows is there. So we need to stimulate the appetite. We need to ensure she does not have enterical constipation, so she feels much better. And you need to maintain a proper feed intake during the lactation period. Whatever you do now in this moment will allow you or not to have a proper milk yield and a proper feed intake during the beginning of the lactation period. Of course, one of the critical parameters we have to take into consideration is the water intake of the sow. So sows in their top moment, they can drink up to 30 liters of water per day, but they will not drink it over the entire day in 30 times. They will stand up, they will drink the water when they need it, and the rest of the time they will lay down. So you have to ensure that the water is available all the time with the right pressure, so when the animal is drinking, is getting what he needs. And in this moment, in transition, they start drinking 15 liters of water because they need to start mobilizing to produce proper amount of colostrum and to ensure a proper milk yield. If they don't get the water, no matter what you do, it's compromised already. And how can you see if a sow is in an optimal conditions or not? You can talk to the animal. The animal will tell you how it looks like. So if you see a sow on the right side of the screen that lays down, quiet, all the piglets that are suckling on the teats, most likely you have a sow that is not too much under stress or pain. But if the sow is spending most of her time like is behaving, the sow on the left side of the screen, something is going on. And I still remember my grandfather was telling, if you see the sow that is not giving the milk for the piglet, you need to go there, push her, she needs to stand. But sometimes the sow stays like this because it's in a super uncomfortable situation. The inflammation around farrowing is super important to manage. So maybe in this moment is where you want to give some anti-inflammatory to the sow, either through water or through feed for that specific amount of time, so that the sow can have some pain relief and she can accept the piglet more. Because if the sow has MMA in that moment, for sure she does not like to have the piglet going and get to the teeth because she's in pain. And there are specific correlations that tell us how much the farrowing durations is correlated with the energy supply we provide, and which is the number of stillborn that we can expect after the farrowing. So it's not so big, so maybe it's not so easy to see, but you see the correlation between the farrowing and the time between the last meal and the farrowing. So it's very important as well that also toward the farrowing we ensure the sow has feed available, but not to ad libitum, especially the day of the farrowing, because we don't want the sow to refuse the feed after. So we need to manage properly so that she always have fresh feed and she can get attracted to this feed, because if it stays there for 20 hours, maybe the feed starts becoming a little bit rancid, is not attractive, or is mixed too much with water. So it's super important, and we see how it is directly correlated with the amount of stillborn that we can expect at the end of the day. And is very linked with farrowing duration. This is super impacted by our strategy that is happening during the transition period. And one of the challenges we have is about constipations. So the more we can avoid the sow to have constipation and position ourselves with a feces condition score toward the 3 and not 1 and 2, the highest the chance that our farrowing duration will be shorter. Because if you have an intestine that is super constipated, the space you have to ensure that the reproductive tract, in particular the uterus, have space for the contraction is more limited. So the piglet will have high risk of mortality during this moment, because if the pressure is high in the farrowing channel, you can have high risk of rupture of the umbilical cord, which is the 71% primary cause of stillborn. And they die during the farrowing because of hypoxia. They don't have oxygen. So that's one of the practical situations we can impact just by working 5-7 days before farrowing. Feed intake during lactation. So after the sow has finalized their farrowing, the job begins again, because she needs to push for milk production. And if you think about it, it's super demanding what we ask the sow to do. We need to be super careful on day 1 after she starts farrowing, because if we get wrong the access to the feed or the feeding management of the sow in that day, we have problems for the first 10 days after lactation. And the piglet will not grow as expected, and we will have higher pre-weaning mortality before the 3 days after they're born. So ensure fresh feed and water, okay? If we have some leftovers, remove it. I don't know how you are doing here, but in a lot of countries, there is mixed feeding. You have feed that is mixed together with water. So if that is happening, the suggestion is don't add water yourself. Have the sow asking for the water from the feeder directly, because usually the tendency from a human is to add too much water, and is too much compared to what the sow would like, and you have a lot of leftover. So in that case, you have a loss on the feed, which is a cost for the farm. The sow is not eating, and in that case, you have a stop of the proper milk production. Again, check if the water is properly working. Have the trough daily clean from leftovers, and at least at the beginning of lactation, try to feed multiple times a day and go check how the sow is behavior. Eventually, you can also do some top dress if you want to stimulate the sows, but that really depends on the situation of the farm and in which climate we are. In winter is not a big problem, because the sow is in a thermoneutral condition from 18 to 22 degrees. So right now I think the sows are feeling well on the farm. But I come from Italy, and right now in Italy we have heat waves, and in certain areas we have registered 45, 48 degrees last week, and this week as well. So imagine the sow how is prone to eating. Okay, so in that case, we need to really watch very closely what is happening there. And one other challenge we have is that is true. We have an ideal temperature for the sow, but we also have an ideal temperature for the piglet. So we always, in swine, in sow herd, we need to do a lot of compromise. We'll see a little bit later. And if we go back a little bit to what we were talking about the gilts, we need to ensure the gilt that usually is a very good milker. She gives a lot to her piglet at her first parity, that we don't compromise the gilt after this is completed. We have to avoid the animal to lose too much body condition, because otherwise in the next gestation and next lactation will be much more less performing. So in certain situation, we even, it's not really the ideal practice, but if you see that your gilt has lost too much condition, you may lose one cycle and wait for the other one, especially if it's a super good gilt. You will empower her to produce much more pro-efficiently in the next cycle. And there is a clear correlation between the mobilization and the weight loss during the lactation and the productivity of the sow. So you see here, there is a gold recommendation that below a certain level, you should not get worried too much. But if you lose more than 10, 12% of body weight during lactation, that's a big problem. One of the factors also to take into consideration is colostrum and milk production. Those are some basic management nutritional tips. Those will all be available in the slide as for the rest of the team, but it's just to remind all the critical point and make ourselves a little bit of homework on our farm, saying, am I doing these actions? Am I taking care of really making sure my animals are getting enough colostrum? If I have 17 born alive, maybe I need to do split suckling at the beginning for the colostrum to ensure that all the piglets are getting the right amount of intake of colostrum, especially if I plan to do some cross fostering as well. So those are some of the parameters or tips that we have to make attention. And as well, during the first few days, again, water intake, super critical. Sows are a little bit like humans, tend to be lazy, okay? So we need to stimulate them. And if they stand up to drink or to eat, we need to make sure that they have available what they need, because they will not stand up a second time. So that's true, okay? And you can see that an average sow, for example, can drink up to 30 liters of water per day. It's not a cow, but still, the amount of water intake is a lot. And if we feed the sow all at the same time, they may drink all at the same time. So the water pressure should still ensure that all the sow that are eating and drinking at the same time get the right amount of water. So that's the moment where you have to check the nipples. We were talking before a little bit about stressed sows, okay? That's probably my veterinarian mindset sometimes comes back. When you have a stressed sow, you need to ensure she feels well from a well-being perspective, because if an athlete, if a car, if everything is in good condition, will work much better. And the sow is the same. If we have the sow that are not in pain, they will give everything they have. But if the sow is in pain, she will avoid to take too much care of the piglet, will be much more stressed. And one of the consequences is that the piglet will not grow as we expect, but on the other side, we may increase the number of piglets that are crushed. So here are some recommendations or suggestions to see. I was happy to see this morning in the presentation the comment about vaccinations. Vaccination is critical. It's super important. But we all got vaccine sometimes in life. You don't feel great the same day you get the vaccine. I mean, if you get a yellow fever vaccine, I can tell you that for 3 or 4 days, you don't feel super well. If you give the vaccinations the wrong day during the lactation, you drop the performance of the sow. Maybe for 1 or 2 days, the sow is not eating. That's a big impact. Remember the correlation between the weight loss and the farrowing loss also, and the performance of the sow. So maybe the vaccination plan need to be checked and studied and implemented in different moments if we see that the sows in a certain condition, they drop feed intake. So that's important point to take. As well, consider the crates. I heard sometimes we get sows 10, 11, 12, 13 parity, but the crates are always the same. 6, 7 parities, I think they can stay in every crate, but above a certain moment, the sow grows a lot, also in terms of body weight, and their condition is even less comfortable. We heard a little bit this morning about flushing, so I wanted to take this opportunity to remind why it's important and why a super short period of time within our peak production is so critical to ensure a proper productivity. Okay, so I will not enter too much into the details because just on this slide we may take 2 hours, but very easy on the messaging. This is happening. This is what is happening when we start the ovulation on the sow. Okay. So our sows, around 24, 25 days of lactation, start to ovulate. And then the ovocytes are released, they got fertilized, they go to the uterus, they get implanted, and eventually, at the end of the gestation, you have the piglet born. You see that during the entire process, you have a lot of losses. I don't know if I have the light. It's okay, I can survive. You see down here which are the critical periods and which are the percentage of losses you get during the process. Before the end of implantation, that is between 13 and 16 days, you see how much percentage of eggs we can lose. So if we do a proper flushing period, we increase the opportunity for the sows to ovulate a significant higher number of oocytes. And if we start from a higher number of oocytes, we increase the amount of piglet that we will have at the end of the pregnancy. But moreover, what is more important is that a proper flushing diet, a proper flushing approach does not only have an impact on increasing of the oocytes for the ovulation, also have an impact on the increase of the quality of the oocyte and the eggs that are formed after. So you will reduce the risk of loss due to imperfection, failure of fertilization, because what you want to have working in this short period of time is to have embryos that are super homogeneous, that will increase the uniformity of the piglet once they are born. So what we see in practice, and yes. Yeah, you can move to the next slide. It's okay, no problem. Yeah. So just to stay on this one, because there is really a lot to say. Standard, you can produce up to 20 to 25 oocytes that are fertilized. Okay. So if you start from 20 and you lose 40% during the process, you will have a certain number of piglets that are born. But if you start from 25, you still lose more or less 40%, but the number of piglets that you get out at the end of the pregnancy is significantly different. I was saying, just to anticipate the next slide, because it's just written. No, it's not working. It's okay. A proper flushing period in terms of diet is not only related to sugar intake of the sows. So sometimes we hear flushing is sugar, because with the sugar, what you do, you stimulate the insulin release because you increase the amount of peak of glycemia in the blood. And that's true, because with this system, you fake the brain of the sows, and you will tell the sow that she's ready for a proper ovulation. Okay, yes. But that only have an impact on the amount of ova that are produced, not on the quality. So when we work on a proper flushing diet, you need to take care also from a micronutrition perspective, also micronutrients that are responsible to increasing the quality of the eggs, that will be responsible to increase the homogeneity of the piglet at birth. I will go a little bit faster because this is just an example of a flushing feeding schedules. To make it practical, not everybody at farm can manage a flushing complete diet. Usually the recommendation is to use a gestation diet, and you use a top dress on top for 5-6 days according to which are you are winning into estrus interval. And that alone, those 5-6 days have a significant impact on the number of live-born and also on the weaned piglet, because you increase the uniformity and the homogeneity of the piglet, and what you want to have at the end of the day is to have uniform piglet. Maybe it's not important to have a piglet birth weight average at 2 kilo if your big piglet is 3 kilo and your smaller piglet is 800 grams. Maybe it's better to have 1.5, 1.45, but your range of difference of weight is plus minus 200 grams. So that's a super important aspect to take into consideration, because it's proven by literature and practice that your litter that are much more uniform and homogeneous are the ones that performs best and are the ones who have less pre-weaning mortality. Also because their behavior is much more similar. So we work a lot on livability, especially during flushing, and this is one of the strategy we improve. We want to push the average birth weight uniformos on the right side of the Gaussian curve of our birth weight. Then some factors we want to take into considerations after birth that are super important on piglet to ensure a proper survivability and performance. Of course, we mentioned a little bit about birth weight, because there is a strong correlation between the birth weight and body weight after 149 days reported in literature, because the highest is the homogeneity and the piglet birth weight, the lowest the pre-weaning mortality. And with the genetic we have today, we tend to have a lot of piglet born. Our job is to make sure that all those piglets survive and reach the growing stage, because Zimbabwe, South Africa, also Italy and Spain and other southern market, our target is kilo sow meat per year. So if I have 15 or 17 piglet born alive, but I lose 5, that's a little bit of an issue. Sometimes I prefer to have maybe 1 piglet less, but much more homogeneous, because at the end of the day, my target is to make sure that all those piglets are survived and much more vital. So from a piglet management standpoint, there are certain things we have to take into consideration, especially day 1, okay? Colostrum intake. How many piglets do I have? If I have 8 piglets, moreover, they will have all the same chances to get the same amount of colostrum. But if I have 15, 16, 17 piglets, and they are born on 330 minutes of farrowing, I need to ensure everyone has the proper access to the colostrum. So one of the strategies we do, for example, is split suckling, because in this case, separating the groups of piglet, you ensure that everyone get their own amount of immunoglobulins coming from the colostrums of the sow. Iron and tail, it's a little bit associated to what we discussed before with vaccine. If you want to provide iron injection, grinding teeth, tail dockling, maybe doing it day 1 is no longer the best strategy, because day 1 is when they get colostrum. If we stress them a lot, maybe they don't have access to the right amount of colostrum the sow is producing, and once they are recovered, colostrum is no longer there, because by day 2nd, 3rd, the sow milk characteristic is changing. So we have compromised since the early beginning how our piglet can perform. So that's also one thing that it should be easy to do, but it's important to take into consideration. Also, antibiotics, injection, and utilization. Not always using an antibiotic as a preventive method of approach is the best thing to do, especially at the beginning of their life, because what you do, you create a lot of challenges in their microflora in the intestine. So in that sense, also with your veterinarians, work very closely to see when is really needed and when is not needed, because every one of us has different perception. Some of us are more sensitive, they want to do a lot of preventive approach, but sometimes better to wait a little bit. Okay? And of course, take it too much, the piglet in your hand is not always the best thing to do. moving a little bit faster. I see that we are running a little bit short on time. Split cycling, some examples on how to do it. As I said, particularly useful in large litters. It's super simple. You create a very small cage that you remove after 2 days. Important, remind to do it and give the same amount of hours of the piglet of the two groups to have access to the colostrum. Super important, and you see which is the impact that can give on the animal. Cross-fostering, I have to say I'm not a big fan of cross-fostering, but sometimes is important. So is important, and there are risks. Because you spread disease in the farm very easily, because you can move disease from one litter to the other without noticing in a moment, but there are situations where you have to do it. So it's important that we take into consideration all these aspects and we check which are the main rules that we want to apply in case we want to do a cross-fostering. So first of all, first point, first day, 2 days, the animals need to have the colostrum access to from their mother, because that colostrum is specifically for them. If you give colostrum of another sow to the piglets, it's good, but the IgG and the immunity, passive immunity, is not transferring through the membrane of the intestine to the piglets. And never transfer a piglet who has diarrhea. Never. That's a super first aspect you have to take into consideration. There is always a debate on which are the right piglet of the litter to transfer. Sometimes people say you should take the bigger piglet, sometimes smaller piglet, but in reality what we have seen in practice and in literature, the medium piglet, the ones that are suckling the central teats, which are the ones that are less aggressive, should be the one that you transfer, because they will fight less to get a new, let's say, org chart inside of a new litter you bring, so you will reduce the amount of stress you bring to those animals. Then there are a lot of strategies. You have 2-step, 3 steps. So we will not enter in the details, but if you want, we can talk a lot about cross-fostering also after the presentation. But it's really critical to be realistic, because fostering is important when, with the standard method we have available, also with crib feeding, we know we don't have real chance to allow the piglet to survive. So in that case, yes, please do cross-fostering, because if the sow does not have the capacity or the potential to feed those piglets with their milk, it's better to foster than to lose them. So there are a lot of studies that shows which are the litter at risk, which are the piglets that have a higher percentage of risk, and which is the number of acceptance you want to give to a sow versus the other. So that tells us how much is really critical for us to avoid losses during the entire first 3 days of life of our piglet. One important aspect, always super easy to check, because it's just enough to buy a thermoscan camera, and it's something that you can really buy for cheap. Check the vitality of the piglet is directly correlated with the color you get out from the thermoscan camera, and is correlated with fostering. Don't foster a piglet that looks like the first one on top, but foster a piglet that is much more vital, because if you move a piglet that is in already hypothermia, that piglet will be for sure not vital and will not fight to get the milk from the new sow. So, for example, this is something very practical to do if you have to do a cross-fostering. And you have a lot of excursion of temperature during day and night, especially in this period of time. So it's even more important to take into consideration. No need to check the rectal temperature, but this is just to show some literature reference on the survivability correlated with the rectal temperature of the animals, correlated with the pre-weaning mortality. So with a thermoscan, you can do it super fast. And you know as well, for example, if you think that a mat is working or not, or if you have to put the lamp closer to the piglet or higher from the piglet. So those are some of the parameters you have to take into consideration, making sure that the piglets are dried, for example, right after they are farrowing. You can grind either with the temperature, with the light, but even with papers that you can grind and put it available in their nest. So you increase the drying of the animal, especially now that is winter. But also in summertime is important because let's always remember that we have always two temperatures to manage in farm, for the sow well-being and for the piglet well-being. So those are critical parameters. There are many different kind of approach we can have on piglet, from the most expensive to the most simple. But what is important is we always take into consideration the two gradient of temperature we want to manage on the sow farm. I remember when I was a child, I was entering the farrowing room. You were sweating. It was so hot, and because the main interest was piglet need to stay 28 degrees. And then you had the sow that were consistent over the year in its stress condition. Now we see a lot the opposite. You enter, is cold, the sow is super well, but the piglet are not well. So we need always to compromise. So we are a complicated industry, if you look about it, and farrowing and everything that is around, it's super important. So also the piglet, based on their behavior, they will tell you if they are comfortable or chilled. Some other practical insight, if you give creep feeding to the animals, check where you position your plate for the creep feeding. Usually the best is to place it close to the head of the sows for multiple reasons. One is the animal will mimic what the sow is doing. So if the sow is eating, they will be interested on trying to eat what's available on them. And also you have higher chance to keep it clean, especially if you plan to do it mixed with a little bit of water. You will limit the amount of flies, and you have to change it very often so that the piglets are attracted to the feed themselves. So there are a lot of studies here on which are the best plate you can use, but the main target is everything you can do to as well train the piglet to get ready to switch to a new diet form after they are weaned. This will be a payback. Maybe they will not eat a lot in this moment, they will waste some feed, but you will have less piglet that will have challenges on recognizing the feed once they are moved into the weaning room. And as well, it's important to consider how many times a day I want to feed my piglets. Okay? Why? Because I prefer to have more subministration of feed during the day with less quantity, so the fish is always fed. The feed is always fresh. Instead of giving it maybe 1 or 2 times higher quantity, because that feed, most likely those animals will not eat them all during the day, and the day after I have to throw it away. So it's a little bit extra labor, but it will pay back, because especially creep feeding or pre-starter, usually high technological feed, expensive, so makes sense not to waste it. Disease, of course, this is something to take into consideration together with the veterinarians, and I come back a little bit on the vaccination program. Study very well, according to the condition of your farm, the disease you have circulating, when is the right moment to vaccinate both piglet and sow to avoid lack of performances. Because after vaccinations, you're sure the animal will have challenges. Then I have a little bit of part on identifying all the areas that are critical in our sow herd. You know, we are, in this perspective, this specific physiological stage is super complicated. We do have a lot of areas that we should focus. You don't have to focus all in one, but based on your facilities at home, you can identify 1 or 2 actions to take immediately already tomorrow, start working, because those are easy things you can implement and will have a direct impact on reaching closer goal to your genetic potential. Because everything you do here will have a significant impact on how your farm will perform. So I don't know where you stand here, but for example, if you know the temperature is a challenge, maybe focus on the first 2 weeks, the work on the heat lamps. Or if you know that ventilation is a challenge, let's focus there. Don't do everything at the same time, select 1 or 2, and then you work on that. Once that is okay, you work on the second aspect. Important to set up clear criteria. I would skip this one because it's correlated to that. But what is super important is to always remind that in a little bit less than a month and a half, everything you do there, it has a direct impact on your profitability of the farm. We talk a lot about efficiency. We have seen a lot of different areas where we can improve ourselves. And one of the most important aspects is that the sow, we have one sow, but in reality it's like if we have 4 sow, because every sow, in every specific physiological moment, we tend to treat it differently from a management and from a nutritional perspective, because the work that the sow need to do in that specific moment is different, from carrying the piglet to let them grow, farrow, milk, get ready again into estrus. So again here, don't focus all your actions in all the different areas of the sow production. Focus first on 1 or 2 actions. Maybe you don't have a flashing program in place. Maybe start working on a flashing. It just takes 5-6 days of work. It pays back at the end of the day. You have a flashing, but you don't work on a transition diet. Try to see what is happening on a transition. And if you do one step at a time, implementation of all the different technologies or the different care that we want to put from a nutritional and management perspective, I am sure that every year you will move closer and closer and closer to the genetic potential the sow can get. So I think I got a little bit longer than expected, so I'm sorry for that. We had a lot of information shared, so I hope it was useful. And thanks again for your attention. Looking forward for questions and interactions later on.